Throughout the 19th century, Americans invaded Native American territory and persisted in trying to take over all of their land. The United States government even tried to Americanize the Native Americans in their hundreds of boarding schools. In the 20th century, Americans began treating Native Americans with more respect and recognizing them for their heritage. Many Native Americans became literate and were able to use their European-influenced education to their benefit, recording and passing on the stories of their tribes.
The students that came here and learnt skills that they could never have learnt had they stayed at home. Their horizons were much broader because they left the reservation. Of course, they were only really being equipped to join at the very bottom of the social scale.
The formal education changed the natural plains into villages of industrialization and trade. Native American boarding schools were places of cultural genocide, leaving behind a deep scar in the heritage and diplomacy of Indian Americans.
They lost their native names, they lost their languages, their clothes were taken away from them, all of the medicine that they had brought with them, the foods that they had brought with them, that was put aside as inferior and not to be used at the school.
European Americans started the schools in an attempt to resolve conflict and assimilate new members into their society. Education was to be used to minimize cultural opposition.
We should be proud of who we are. We should be proud of our heritage.
The plan for reconciliation instead morphed into a century-long cultural genocide. This impacted the later translation of the indigenous heritage. Children who no longer knew their native language could neither speak it with family nor pass on the language. The consequences of this movement were grave. The failure resulted in the death of 50% of the school children and traumatization of the survivors. Because the students were physically and psychologically assaulted, they suffered from serious alcoholism, suicide, and the transmission of trauma to later generations.
Dysfunctionality we find in Native communities, I would say we could directly trace back to really the pain and the grief, sort of the intergenerational trauma that gets handed down through generations as a result of, this traumatic period of Native peoples.
There were a lot of kids that went to boarding school that didn't do well. I know a person that I had gone to boarding school with. He had a lot of family issues. He was adopted and lived in Kotzebue. And we were very, very close friends. And shortly after he left boarding school, he jumped off the San Francisco Bridge. My mother was an alcoholic.
They were unable to raise their children and hold jobs to provide financial support for their families, causing widespread poverty and the continued destruction of each tribe's economic setting.
The boarding school system led to all kinds of psychological and cultural problems, social problems.